Welcome everyone to the latest in the HKS seminar series, which is Can the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Be Resolved? Today we're going to be graced with Dr. Leila Farsakh, who's going to ask and perhaps answer, let's hope, the question of can an alternative solution be found? In the past we've had discussions about the internal Palestinian reconciliation. We've also had people discuss the issue and the role of Palestinian refugees. At our last event, there was a discussion about Israel and the Iron Wall of 2012. And previously we heard from Robert Malley, who discussed the role of the United States in terms of where the peace process is going. And one of the interesting things that has come out of almost all of the talks is this idea that the peace process seems to be dead. And if the peace process is dead, then where do we go from here? Is it that the peace process is flawed, or is it that the solution that we're looking for is perhaps flawed? So I'm delighted today to introduce Leila Farsakh. Dr. Leila Farsakh is an associate professor in political science at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She's the author of Palestinian Labor, Migration to Israel, Labor, Land, and Occupation, 2008. And she's the editor of Commemorating Nexa, Evoking the Nakba. She holds a PhD from the University of London and an MPhil from the University of Cambridge. And in 2001, Dr. Farsakh won the Peace and Justice Award from the Cambridge Peace Commission. I'm delighted that she's going to be discussing today this issue of can an alternative solution be found. And thank you and welcome, Leila.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And thank you for all of you to be here on such a grim day. I thought I would find just 3 people, so I'm very delighted to have many of you today here. In the half hour that I have here, 40 minutes, I'm going to try to address what Diana had asked me to do in the letter she sent me out. She said, if you could address what are the alternatives to the peace process, and in particular, when you do that, please address the issue of the Palestinian United Nations bid, and then talk about the one-state solution, so which are interrelated. And I think that's what I'm going to do today, because I think it's very important when we're trying to think of alternatives to look at the UN bid, the Palestinian UN bid, in other words, the Palestinian attempt to get a full membership at the United Nations as a state member. Because this is an attempt to rescue or salvage the peace process, or if you want, to cash the Palestinian state, which has been the Palestinian goal ever since 1988, which is now about 24 years of struggle. And it is at the core of the two-state solution. And the way I'm going to do it is look how the Arab Spring tied these two issues with the Arab Spring, because the Arab Spring can explain to us why the Palestinians decided to go to the UN to acquire full UN membership, and also shows us why this process failed and why the one state, or what could be an alternative to the two-state approach to solving the conflict. Because I think the Arab Spring, although today we're very worried about how it's going to go, and we already hear some voices saying that it might be an accident of history that will not materialize into something concrete, I tend to think that the Arab Spring actually brought some major changes into the region, and central among them is the importance of rights and the struggle for rights, and away from an obsession with statehood. And I think this provides an interesting introduction to how the one-state solution could have a future and can be an alternative. So the first thing is the UN bid. Why did the Palestinians decide to go to the United Nations to ask full membership for the Palestinian state? And as I said, it is, in my view, an attempt by the Palestinians to cash their Palestinian state, an attempt to salvage, for the last time, the two-state solution. It's important because we have to bear in mind that the international consensus has been since, I would say, since 1947, since the UN resolution, that the only solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is a two-state solution. In 1947, the idea was an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Jewish state got materialized. The Arab state became defined as a Palestinian state de facto only in 1988. In 1988, the Palestinian National Council, which is the body of the PLO, met in Algiers and voted on the Declaration of Independence. In other words, the Palestinians declared independence, declared that they are establishing their state. And it's important because that statement said as well that we're recognizing UN Resolution 242, which implicitly recognizes Israel. So in 1988, on the Palestinian, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, they came around to accept that the only solution on offer is a two-state solution, and the only thing the Palestinian can obtain is a Palestinian state on part of Palestine, on 22% of historic Palestine. And they used this in order to enter the Oslo negotiations. And the Oslo negotiations, although not based, not goal-oriented towards a Palestinian state, it was based on two very important concepts. One is Israel's admission for the first time, Israel's official admission, that the Palestinian people are a people with the right to self-determination and that the PLO represents them. And that's something, a major success insofar as the Palestinians are concerned, because up until 1993, the Israeli referred to those in the West Bank and Gaza as Arabs, not Palestinians, whose fate is to be resolved with the Arab states, meaning Jordan. There was not such a thing called Palestinian nationalism, and nor a concept of this land has to be shared with the Palestinians. And in Oslo, in the famous White House lawn shake of the handshake on the 13th of September 1993, Rabin, at the time the Prime Minister of Israel, made a very important speech in which he said that we the Israelis have to admit that we have to share this land with the Palestinians. And the whole Oslo process ever since has been about how to share this land. But the concept of sharing was confirmed, institutionalized with the Oslo peace process. Now, the problem of Oslo, as you all know, and we don't need to go over it now, is the fact that in this process of accepting the partition of the land, Israel said it's going to define the parameters of this partition and the content of this partition. And de facto, instead of getting a state, the Palestinians ended up having fragmented territories and having something more analogous to a Bantustan reality than to a viable state. But it's important to continue that if you look at the second Intifada, the 2000, we get another recognition, international recognition, which is very important, which is the roadmap of 2002. The roadmap, which was a US-backed roadmap to peace, supported by the Quartet, which is the United Nations, the EU, the US, and Russia, came up again in support of the two-state solution. So again, we are in an international verdict that the solution is a two-state solution. But most importantly, and for the first time, it officially said that the only solution to the conflict is not just two-state solution, Arab and Jew, but it said the only solution to the conflict is a Palestinian state. In other words, the international community, the United States, the broker of the peace process, said bluntly that we need a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, needs to be contiguous, although with provisional borders, that's the trick word, but still it accepted the concept of a Palestinian state. And once the state is established, and once a just solution is found to the refugee problem, this conflict is over. And all the effort has been canalized for the past 10 years, since 2002 until today, in trying to materialize the state, defined to be within the borders of 1967, having an international consensus, and also bringing about the modalities for achieving it. What is very important about the roadmap to peace is that it wanted to counter the problem of Oslo, which was not goal-oriented. It said we have a goal. We want to get to a state, a Palestinian state, and also we have the means to obtain it. The way to get to establish a Palestinian state, two things need to happen. First of all, the Palestinians have to prove that they can provide security for Israel, and they have to prove that they can have the institutions of a state. It's a very colonial discourse, but let's put it on the side. But it's very important that it tried to provide a goal to the negotiation and also a means to how we're going to come about doing it. And it also said that settlements have to stop. Israel should not expand more settlements. Now, interestingly enough, the Palestinian Authority delivered on both accounts. It delivered on providing security, especially after the death of Arafat and the election of Mahmoud Abbas, and the arrival of the Fayyad government after the takeover of Gaza by Hamas. But it's very important between 2007 and 2012, we find that the Palestinian Authority has delivered on the security front insofar as it reformed its police force, it coordinated with the United States and the Israeli security forces on maintaining security, it being trained by American security officials about how to maintain security of the population as well as to prevent any attack into Israel. We see since 2007 we didn't have any suicide bombing or any major attack into Israel. And we also see a pacification of the population in the West Bank and an ostracization of Gaza. Gaza is out of the picture. Gaza is the bad one, West Bank is the good one. And the war on Gaza just confirmed the split between Palestinian and the West Bank, between Fatah and Hamas, but above all it emphasized how much the PA is delivering on security. And also it delivered on institution buildings. The Fayyad government program has been towards a Palestinian state. We're going to have fiscal reform, which it indeed carried out. We're going to create employment, thanks to the money being financed by the European Union, which represents today around 20 to 25% of the Palestinian GDP. And we're going to create educational reforms. We're going to create all the institutional reform needed to create a viable state. And on top of that, we got the World Bank and the IMF, the two institutions that finance the Palestinian or canalize the money going to the Palestinian Authority, giving the verdict in 2011, the Palestinians are a state, we can testify that they are a state, they have a good police force, they have a judiciary, they take care of women, they reform the situation of women, they have a parliament. Yeah, it's true, it did not, been active lately, but the institution is there. So on all fronts, the Palestinians have created the institution for the state. And nothing materialized. Negotiations, as most of you know, were halted in 2010 because Israel would not continue the moratorium on settlements, and negotiation went nowhere. So we enter, when the Arab Spring arrives, the Palestinian Authority is caught in a very difficult situation. That it delivered on security, it delivered on institution building. It is losing legitimacy among its population because the neoliberal policy that it imposed have been quite taxing. And it has not cashed all what it invested into its state. And here comes the Arab Spring that had a major effect on the Palestinian street, not as well reported in the West as what has happened in Tunis or Egypt. But it's important because Palestinians went to the streets. And they went to the street already in February of 2011. And all focus was geared towards the March 15 movement, where the slogan that the Palestinian street had, the Palestinian want the end of the Palestinian division. And that was a very important message because basically the young, as well as the political parties, because people present the March 15 movement as it is just a bunch of young kids who went to the street saying we want end of the division, but actually if you look carefully, it's NGOs, it's Palestinian parties on the left, it's Palestinian political figures quite known, be it from Hanan Ashawi to Mustafa Barghouti, or a very wide spectrum, all saying our demands, we demand on the authority to end the division between Hamas and Fatah. But they also said two very important things that did not get well covered in the media. They said we want elections, and we are for the end of corruption of the PA, very important element. And we want election not just of the PA, but we want election of the Palestinian National Council. So with this, they are saying something very important. They're saying that the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza do not represent all the Palestinians, and the future needs to be decided among all Palestinians, which requires a reinvigoration of the Palestinian national institutions, which is the PLO and the Palestinian National Council. The Palestinian National Council represents all the Palestinians in the diaspora, the refugees, inside 48 and the West Bankers. The PA represents just those who are in the West Bank. We need to have elections on those, and we need to have a larger debate about Palestinian national rights, especially in view of the fact that we did not get a state, we are unlikely to get a state. And they also emphasize something very important, that the state is not what is important for us. What is important is Palestinian rights. And Palestinian rights are not just right to statehood, the right of return and right to equality within Israel. So we're having a population framing Palestinian, calling for a reinvigoration of a Palestinian-wide discussion on where do we go from now on, given that we tried for 25 years to materialize this Palestinian state. We did not get it. All what we got is further fragmentation of Palestinian land, a split between Gaza and West Bank. Within the West Bank, the north is cut from the south. Jerusalem is completely out of the picture. So, and our struggle is a struggle of right. And I think it is within this context that we need to understand the Palestinian United Nations bid. Because the decision by the PA to go to the United States, to the United Nations, was basically trying to squash, if you want, the Palestinian resistance on the street and translate it and monopolize it in order to give a last sprint on the last attempt at the Palestinian state. And if you read carefully Abbas's speech at the UN, you see it's a very beautifully crafted speech, brilliantly crafted speech, in which he tried, in a very intelligent way, to address the Palestinian street demands, to take them into consideration, but to stamp them with a Fatah monopoly of the definition of what are Palestinian national rights. So, for example, we see the first thing he says that at the time when the Arab Spring is about Arabs going to the street demanding for democracy, the Palestinian Spring is not about ending corruption. Democracy is about independence. He also says that the idea of a Palestinian state is a Palestinian national consensus, is not something that the PA came up like this out of the blue. It is a consensus based on a Palestinian National Council resolution in 1988. It included all the parties in it. Everybody bought into it. And this is what he's trying to bring into fruition. He's also saying that the entity presenting this demand to seek full UN membership of the Palestinian state, which is recognized by 120 states. We should not forget this Palestinian state is recognized by 120 states, not by the US or Europe, but still by a large consensus of the international community. This bid is not being presented by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, it's being presented by the PLO. So again, he's reclaiming the legitimacy of the PLO in all this process because he's also the chairman of the PLO. And by going to the UN, he's precisely saying, with this, we are reclaiming our right for a state, but we're also reiterating the right of the refugees, and Resolution 194. We are objecting to Israel's violation of Palestinian rights, not just in the West Bank, but also in Site 48, which is another very big statement to make. So he tried to recollect all Palestinian rights together and reassert that the only way how you're going to protect Palestinian rights is through the state model. And he tried to bring an innovation on. This is how the supporters of the two-state solution took his speech to be a positive speech and a positive step. He basically sent a message that the way to achieve this state, so on the objective, we're still on the same objective. The solution remains, the alternative is still a Palestinian state. What needs to change is the means. To achieve a Palestinian state from now on is not through negotiations, it's not through the US monopoly of the peace process, it's not through Israel's continuous obstruction by building settlement, but actually by internationalizing the conflict again. It's bringing it by the UN. So seeking a legal strategy, seeking a UN repositioning, which I think is a very intelligent move, but practically did not materialize into anything. And it did not materialize into anything for two reasons. One, because the UN cannot act without the support of the superpowers. And secondly, because Abbas continues to backtrack on the means, because they are, I think, at a loss of strategies, because this is a whole generation that fought for the Palestinian state and cannot think of any alternative to a Palestinian state to achieve Palestinian demands, given, again I say that's very important, given that the international consensus and the only legal tools you have are tools that are geared towards a two-state solution, not a one-state solution. So, as I said, we went to the UN, we had a big fanfare, he had standing ovation, everybody was impressed, but nothing materialized. And after US pressure, the Palestinian Authority decided to have indirect talks with the Israelis in Amman. They had 3 sessions of negotiation in Amman in January, and then the negotiation broke. And they broke because basically Israel said it's not budging from its position. And not only that, Israel for the first time, although it reiterated that its condition for the establishment of a Palestinian state is through negotiation, and that this state has to be demilitarized, which the Palestinians accept, that the Jordan Valley will be still under quasi-Israeli control, or demilitarized, and that Jerusalem, had always reiterated that Jerusalem is an eternal capital of Israel, which the Palestinians object to. But for the first time, Israelis have also said, not only that they will act, the settlements are part of Israel, but they showed, or they suggested that they're going to annex significant settlement blocks, which was never on the table. The idea of Israel annex settlement blocks, which means that it will annex the Arael block, it will annex the Bitar al-Lid block, which is around Bethlehem. This confirms the fragmentation of the West Bank into three major areas. You're going to have the north separated from the center and the center separated from the south. And it just proves that Israel is not interested in negotiation, fears that there's nothing pressuring it to have a Palestinian state, and that it can continue managing the conflict like that, especially that you don't have any major attacks. And even if you have, actually in Israel's interest to have more suicide attacks, because then it puts the blame on Palestinians being the ones unable to stop intrusion on the peace process. So that we're stuck again. And I think the best example of how we're stuck is when we get UC Balin, who's an architect of the Oslo peace process, a very dear friend of Mahmoud Abbas, writing a letter in Foreign Affairs asking and telling Abbas, look, you're a very good friend of mine. We've been in this for over 25 years. There's nothing more I care about than this one, but we have to admit we failed, and you're better off resigning and handing the keys back to the occupation. So when your Israeli counterpart tells you you should dismantle the PA, a long demand presented by various Palestinian groups, and what you should do is put back the responsibility on Israel, you realize the project is over. Oslo is over. How do you go from there? And I think this is a very good venue to talk about the one-state solution. I think many people are talking about the one-state solution, including people from within the PA. Ahmed Iqrea has been talking about it. He was an ex-prime minister. Palestinian Authority, when they use it as a threat. It's like, you're Israeli, if you don't want the two-state solution, look, there's worse. There's the one-state solution. So come and give us the state. But if you look a little bit at the trajectory of the one-state solution, you have to bear in mind, and that's one Israeli scholar once said it, those who promote the one-state solution historically have always been the weaker side. Those who offered it and presented it in the 1920s and 30s were Jewish minorities, people like Yehuda Magnus and Martin Buber, who formed Brit Shalom and Ehud, argued that we need a binational state in Israel. That's the only just way to move forward. They were the smaller part, the weaker part. And today, the one who are the advocates of the one-state solution tend to be, for the majority, Palestinians. And Palestinians in the diaspora mainly, some refugees, and the Palestinians inside 48 were those who first promoted it, but not in such a verbal way as we wanted to say solution, a one-state solution. Now, when you talk about the one-state solution, you're basically talking about two models. You're talking either about a secular democratic state, which is what the Palestinians presented in 1971. That was a form or slogan. The only solution is a secular democratic state in which Jews, Muslim, and Christian live together. Or you talk about a binational state, a form of federation, which is what Yehuda Magnus and Martin Buber talked about in 1946 and put forward to the United Nations, UNSCOP, United Nations Special Commission on Palestine then. Now, those who debate the one-state solution today are not so much interested in the modality of the state. You know, they don't go into, let's go and sit down and try to imagine the federal structure of the state. Let's talk whether it's going to be more like the Belgian model or the Switzerland model, what legal strategy we need to take. They're still not there. I think most of the attention today on the one-state idea focuses on three things: on explaining its rationale, explaining its morality, why it's a good idea, and thinking of strategies to obtain it. Insofar as the rationale is concerned, those who promote the one-state idea argue, like, look, we tried a two-state solution and it failed. So, and that's actually the strongest argument today for the one-state solution. Basically, we tried a two-state solution, Israel doesn't want it. We are in de facto one-state reality. Meron Ben-Benesti, already deputy mayor of Jerusalem in the 1970s, since the 1980s has been talking, we are in a binational reality. We are in a one-state reality. You can call it colonial, you can call it not colonial, you can call it waiting for a solution, but reality we have one state called Israel controlling the whole land and the whole people from the river to the sea. But those who are arguing today is that, okay, we are in a binational, we are in a one-state reality. We tried a two-state solution, it failed. Israel doesn't want to implement a viable two-state solution. And demographically, you know, we're talking now about an area that has nearly parity between Jews and Arabs. So continuing keeping 40% of the population, that is the West Bankers, and Gaza without political rights is just a recipe for further trouble down the road. In terms of morality, those who argue for the one-state solution tell you that it's more moral, it's more just, because everybody can live in Palestine. The Israelis, as much as the Palestinians, are attached to this land. Muslim, Christians, and Jews, religious people among them, are attached to this land. The one-state solution allows them to live there. It protects equal rights to all, and the binational version actually protects national rights. And in that respect, they're doing something very important. They're trying to separate the nation from the state. And here, evoking Judah Magnus's argument, who argued in the 1930s, the Jews do not need a state to survive. The Jews existed all their life without a Jewish state. What the Jews want to do in Palestine is to have a national home, and the national home doesn't need to be a state. It doesn't need to be territorial. Okay? What we mean by this is that we want to have the ability to express our language, revive our culture, live with our neighbors. We need to have autonomy, but we don't need a state. So it's a very important point, separating the nation from the state. And on the Palestinian side, they're trying to separate self-determination from the state. That you can have self-determination without having a state. And what we mean by that is, again, nationality, autonomy, protection of a certain cultural identity you care about in a formula which guarantees rights to all. In terms of how to attain it, that's where the stumbling block hits. Because everybody gets stuck. Everybody agrees it has to be a non-violent strategy. It necessarily requires a strategy of partnership. In other words, if you want to live in one state, Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims, need to talk together and need to figure out the state together. And we are in a context that has never made contact between the two sides as difficult as it is today. Physically, because of the war, and materially and psychologically, because the Palestinian side feel any talk with Israelis is just an attempt at normalization. It's getting Israel off the hook, and it's compromising, and the Israelis have to do their work for themselves and wake up one day and realize that they are unjust. And I think this is also problematic. But the idea of how you're going to talk to the other side, especially when also the Israelis do not know the Palestinians. The war had made it so, had made the Palestinian either a terrorist or a mysticized creature you don't really know, you're either scared or you idealize, so it's very, very difficult at that level. And most activists for the one-state solution, what they opted for is an unbalanced activism based on BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction. And often when we find a dialogue taking place, we find it happening in the diaspora, the space where it's much easier for Palestinian and Israelis to meet, Palestinians and Jews to meet and mobilize for the one-state idea. So how can it move? I mean, can it really be an alternative? I mean, saying the two-state solution is dead is fine, but saying that the one-state solution is around the corner is not true, because it's not around the corner. And I think the challenges facing the one-state movement is maybe as big as those to implement the two-state solution. And I think many people still tell you it's better to go for a two-state solution because we have the tools to implement it, rather than start from scratch for a new idea, which is the one state, where we still do not have legal tools. We don't have any legal document in support of a one state idea. We need to revive them. How are we going to go to the UN and say, let's have a vote on a one state solution? Who's going to do this presentation? And there's lots of homework to be done on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. So on the Palestinian side, I have to say there are some things which are very promising, particularly the demand to have election for the Palestinian National Council. This is something very important. Reviving the PLO is very important. Having a national Palestinian discussion where everybody is involved to think of alternatives, because I think the Palestinians are somewhat in a better position in that respect to realize that their strategy has failed and they have to think of an alternative. So that's having a national discussion is very important, but it's not clear it's going to be that easy, because many people do not want, especially in the West Bank and Gaza, not many people are supportive of the one-state solution. You need to re-examine the role of Hamas. I mean, Hamas is on board for the two-state solution. It's not on board for a one-state solution. Hamas needs to rethink many of its strategies and its slogan if it wants to move forward with that, as well as Fatah. On the Israeli side, there's those who are activists for the one-state solution are human rights activists who want a state of rights and Palestinians inside 48 who are building on Azmi Bsarar's slogan that we want Israel to be a state of its citizen. A very important slogan. And in my view, the people who can move forward the one-state idea, I think, are the Palestinians inside Israel. Palestinian citizens of Israel, because they are historically the best placed to take the Palestinian national movement forward. Because if you look historically at the Palestinian national movement, in the 60s and 70s it was led by the refugees. In the 80s and 90s it was the locus was the Palestinian of the West Bank and Gaza. And now I think the moment has come for the Palestinians inside 48 to take the lead of the Palestinian national movement. Whether they're able to take it, it's not clear because they are under heavy attack in Israel, and also because the movement, we are not today where we were 30 or 40 years ago. And on the Israeli side, the problem remains that they need to face two things which are very important to them. The question of identity and the question of the Jewishness of the state. I think the Jewishness of the state, a demand that Israel has been emphasized over and over again, is, I think, one of the major obstacles for the one-state solution, but also the solution to the possibility of taking one state. Because without addressing this issue of the Jewishness of the Jewish state, you cannot move forward with the one-state solution. Because basically you need to address how far the Jews can have a state, be Jew without having a state. And that's an internal Jewish debate, which people on the left are embarking on it. And by the left, I don't mean Yossi Beilin, I mean intellectual academics in certain circles, because Israel doesn't have any more left. Interesting enough, I think the settler movement in Israel is going to be very helpful for the one-state idea because they do not want to divide the land. And they talk about Palestinian civil rights, not about national rights. They are willing to give Palestinians the same right that they have in 48, okay, but taking away national rights. But aware that if Israel is to survive, it cannot, as a democratic state, it cannot avoid addressing the Palestinian question. These Palestinians give them political rights, not national rights. But what needs to be addressed is that the Jews need to address their identity and how far they are part of the Middle East. And this is a very hard issue because Israel's project and Zionist project for the past 63 years has been to prove that Israel is a Western state. Israel has a Western culture. The Arabs incorporated into it the Jews that came from Yemen and from Iraq and from Morocco. It made them negate their Arab past and adopt Israeli identity, which is anchored in the Holocaust, anchored in a Western tradition, anchored in a Western identity, and whose outlook and vision is not towards the East, but towards the West. And how you're going to break that is going to be very difficult. The only one who can do that, I think, are the Arab Jews of Israel. People like Yudish and Hav, Yossi Yona, Tali Hatuka, people from within the Arab community, Israelis of Arab origin, who are reclaiming their Arabness and arguing that Israel needs to accept that half its population is of Jewish origin, and they have Arab origin, and they have Arab links and Arab heritage, and they need to reassert it. And that's a very hard thing for Israel to do, but I think it's central to moving forward to the one-state idea. Israel needing to face its multiple origin. That it's not just linked to the West. It's not just created from the Holocaust. It's not linked to Germany and reparation of Germany and all that. It also has an Arab origin and an Arab culture. Discover basically the Arab dimension of Jewish identity, which is a very fascinating topic. It's very rich, but has been occulted for many years. So this has to be happening within Israel. And within the Palestinian side, the one thing that, when we come in and addressing the one-state idea, I think you can't avoid facing and defining the nationality of the state. I mean, you can create a state of its people, and I think that's very important. But there again, the Arabs, I think, have to face also the fact that Israel is not just made of Arab Jews or majority Arab Jews, and they're just Arabs and they're part of it. There are Zionists, and there are Israelis whose cultural heritage and history is not linked to Iraq and Yemen. It's actually linked to Germany and Austria and Poland. The Holocaust is, they are descendant of Holocaust survivors, not just people who were in Baghdad and Cairo. And facing with all that in order to have a new identity, an identity that is inclusive of the multidimensional of Israeli society as much as of Arab society, is something very important. In that respect, it's requiring of the Palestinian to re-question or to reopen their identity, rather than just be fixated on being a Muslim identity or Arab identity, but just actually take it in a cosmopolitan dimension that requires an introspection that can be hard. Now, are these two processes going to happen? Jews looking into their Arab origins, Arabs looking into a cosmopolitan identity, embracing the Jew on his term, not on our term, okay? On Palestinian terms. Are these happening? I mean, they're not yet happening. They're happening on the margin. There are these discussions. But I like to bring it back to the Arab Spring. I think the Arab Spring has ushered an era, or gave a promise, or a hope, that such a discussion can take place. And this is where I'm optimistic. Because the Arab Spring, for me, what I take from the Arab Spring, it is about a new generation that's coming out and saying, the state does not matter. What matters is my rights. Okay? It's reinventing a form of nationalism, but it's not a chauvinistic nationalism. It's not an ideological nationalism. It's not a religious nationalism. It's a nationalism based on the fact that we want the state to be accountable and give us the right that it claimed we have. And this discourse of shifting from the nature of the state to wanting the state to be accountable to the citizens, in other words, framing the political struggle in terms of rights rather in terms of nation, is a very important debate, and it is central to the one-state debate, because that one-state struggle is a struggle about rights. We all have equal rights. We all have differences, but we have equal rights, and we need to create a state that guarantees these rights. So that's very promising. How long it will take, I don't know, but I would like to end by saying it might feel utopian or too far-fetched. I don't think it's too far-fetched. I'd like just to remind everybody that when people talked about a two-state solution, at least as far as the Palestinians are concerned, in the 1970s, it was considered blasphemous, impossible. How can you talk about a two-state solution? How can you talk about a Palestinian state just on half of Palestine? The slogan in the 1970s was a secular democratic state for all Palestinians. And it took Arafat, actually, around 25 years, yeah? No, from 1970 to 88, yeah, 18 years, or if you want, since 74, so 15 years to prepare the Palestinian public that the only optimal solution and the best solution is a one-state solution, is a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. So it was revolutionary. It was revolutionary and blasphemous to talk about a two-state solution in the 1970s, but it was attained. Or it was, let's put it this way, it was offered by the Palestinians as an act of incredible historical compromise on their behalf. And I think it's a shame that the Israelis did not see that it is in their best advantage to actually materialize and close the file. Okay? I think now we can look at the one-state idea as an idea which can have fruition in 15, 20 years down the road if everybody works on it, and there are lots to work for it, but I don't think it is so unrealistic. Okay, I'll stop and then and take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Leila. I'm just going to use my prerogative as the moderator just to ask a question, then I'll open it up for other questions. And when you pose a question, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself so that Leila knows who she's answering. So Leila, thank you so much for your talk. What I appreciated about it was that you were very honest in saying that it's not as though the one-state solution is sort of lurking around the corner, that there's going to be a lot of work that is involved in bringing this about. Do you see that any of this work is actually taking place? And if it's not, why is it not taking place? I mean, I feel that there's been a lot of growing attention about the issue of one state, but yet not a lot of work that's actually being done. So it's being used incredibly as a slogan, whether it's by people who are on the left or in Israel, people who are on the right. And in the case of the Palestinian Authority, it's been, as you said, it's been used as a threat. In fact, there was an op-ed piece that was penned by Abu Ala, the former prime minister, one of the architects of Oslo, in, I guess, last month, in which he talked about this idea that there is no two-state solution any longer. So the question is why isn't this work taking place?
Do you want to answer or take other questions?
We can open up for other questions, yeah. Please.
There seems to be a line of thought developing in Israel that in order to remove this impetus of continued occupation, that they should proceed to a third unilateral withdrawal. There was an op-ed in the New York Times 8 days ago. And of course, Sharon was headed in that direction before he fell into a coma. What would be the Arab reaction to that? Of course, it wouldn't be all of the West Bank. It would be most of the West Bank.
That was part two of my question.
Okay.
Joe.
Thank you so much.
Somebody here, she wanted to ask? No, sorry. No, sorry.
Thanks so much, Anna Kendi. worked on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict professionally, and I write on Israel diaspora relations for Haaretz and most other people. There's so much to understand and to comment on. But I think one of the things I want to pick up on, we can go on the Arab Jews specifically. They vote for Likud and for Shas. So I don't know where you're seeing these revolutions, but they're not. They would rather have their own separate state, not nation, but state, far more so than a lot of the Ashkenazi Jews themselves, which is a particular challenge. But the other one that I want to throw out to you, the PNC I find very exciting as well. People work on it. The global Jewish diaspora will want to stay if Israel wants to disappear. And you ready for the World Zionist Congress to come back, and that all the Jews and all the Israelis coming on that side. And
Sorry, so the World Zionist Congress as
an institution to have a say on whether Israel decides to go into a binational state, and the challenges of what real diaspora on the Jewish side of that sort of congressional thing being said. How do you see the diaspora Jews not just as an interesting think tank, but as an actual voting population actually come into it? Because there's a lot of work going on that on lots of different things.
That's a good question. Okay. Shall I address these three, and then I will take another round? Okay, so I'll start with the third unilateral withdrawal because I think it's easier to tackle, and then I'll move into the other two questions. I'm not going to forget anyway. With regards to the third unilateral withdrawal, I mean, it could happen, but it will not solve the problem. And I think the reason why it's not happening is because Netanyahu is not very much interested in it, and the Americans are very scared of it because, you're going to create another Gaza. Because what are the options in front of you? You withdraw, you create a Gaza, okay? If you withdraw again after with this war without bilateral negotiations, you can create another problem like Gaza, insofar as you're going to have the people being under siege in a more complicated way, which increases also the cost on the European Union and the international community to finance the people over there. And de facto, even if it were to happen, because that's really it's going to be imposed on the Palestinian, but doesn't mean that we have the Palestinian state, but then it becomes the Palestinian state under foreign occupier. I mean, that's what the UN bid is about. The UN bid is going to the UN and say, okay, we are a state, even if Israel withdrew, we are a state. Now we have legal strategies, we can go through the ICJ and we can go through the ICC. And that's what Israel was very much dreading. It's like, we don't want any legal strategies that can threaten us. So Israel realized that it's not in its interest so much. I mean, the way I read Israeli politics in support to the conflict, it's interested in managing the conflict, not in resolving the conflict. I mean, and the Palestinian issue has become completely trivial to Israeli politics. What Israel now is telling you the problem is Iran is not the Palestinians. The problem is integrating economic problems in Israel. If you look at the Arab or the Israeli Spring or the 10th movement, it was much more concerned about social issues than about Palestine. Palestine was completely absent. The occupation was completely absent from the slogans, although people were aware of it, in order not to antagonize the right and the left. So Israel, okay, fine. Let them be in a big... We have one fancy prison called West Bank and one bad prison called Gaza. And, we can remain like that. So I think unilateral withdrawal is neither here nor there. The real issue is, if you're going to have a state, a Palestinian state, and come and cash it at the United Nations, and even if tomorrow you're going to have a Palestinian state, even this will not solve the problem of Israel being in control of land, which is not it. It's the demilitarized state. I mean, the people in West Bank, in Ramallah, Nablus, all of them are telling you, yeah, we are in support of the state because we want our independence. But practically, they're telling you, these are not our concern. Our concern is how are we going to trade? How are we going to move? How are we going to go out? How are we going to live? It's no longer about independence. Just did not mean anything anymore. Because the reality on the ground is not about that. The reality is about how I'm going to move from A to B. How will I get a permit? The occupation got so much the subcontract, and the occupation became such an individual struggle rather than a collective struggle, that people today tell you whether we get the state, whether they retreat, will not solve our daily problem of how do I get out of the country, how do I get to have people visit me, how do I get to build a bridge or have an economy. It's an economy completely dependent on international aid. So I think these are all tactics to buy time, because people do see, unless you're going to get the goal in Israel saying, we are withdrawing the settlers at all costs, I see this continuing for another 10, 15 years. The real question is the second question, is that how do you translate the impasse you are in into a political program for the one state? Today we don't have a political program for the one state. We have the slogan of the state, we have people fighting for the one state, and the way they, maybe fighting is the wrong word, but advocating the one state, and the way they're doing it through conferences, through the BDS. I think BDS does not take a stand on the one state, two state, but the BDS is framing the Palestinian struggle and struggle for rights. And I think the framing of the struggle in terms of a struggle for rights, for equal rights, is the first step towards making the one state idea a political program. So one can talk about a movement for the one state idea, you cannot talk about a party for the one state idea, and you cannot have a party for the one state idea before each camp sits down and faces the challenges of claiming one state. And for example, I know more about the Palestinian debate. Palestinians have been talking about it. I mean, many people who are not in the authority are telling you, you're crazy to talk for a one state solution. What, you're going to throw all the national acquisition that we obtained for a one state with the Israelis, which will end up meaning that we Palestinians are going to live like the Palestinians inside 48? Yeah, and we're going to become second-rate citizens. Talking for a one-state idea today means accepting de facto that you're going to become a second-rate citizen. It's better than what you are now, which is no citizen at all. But are you willing to do that? And that has to be an internal debate among the Palestinians, that they have to come out and say, okay, we want a one-state. And when you say a one-state, because we have Palestinian sources that allow you to say that, we have the Palestinian National Congress resolution in 1971 saying our slogan is for a one-state solution, a democratic state in Palestine. But in that one, we did not address the Jewish question. We said Jews are going to become Arabs. We did not say that they are Jews who are Israelis and the Israeli identity is Western and they speak Hebrew and they have a very good economy and being with them means they're going to be dominated economically by them. I mean, it's going into a debate what South Africa went to, with the difference that the Palestinians do not have any of the economic leverage that the black South African had, which makes it even harder. Israel is not dependent on the Palestinians economically. It's not dependent on them politically. The BDS is very good just because it's ruining the image. It's threatening the image of Israel, and Israel cares about that. But that's what Israel doesn't like to be. Israel, we have to say, inside every Israeli, they know that there is something not right. You know? So this moral argument actually is a very strong argument on working with Israelis. How are you going to catch this kind of still be harder. So there's where we start to go, because in order for you to make it a movement, the Palestinians need to endorse it as a program. And to endorse it as a program is hard, and I think cannot happen before Hamas gets its share to be in power. And that's the good thing about the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring finally legitimized Islamic politics. Finally, despite the regime not wanting it, but de facto, I mean, the Islamic parties are ending the Arab political system finally. You cannot let them, they're going to govern a bit, more or less. They are proving to you they are so good with the Americans. Look at the Muslim brothers in Egypt. Look at the Nahda in Tunis. Like they're proving to be the Christian Democrats. I mean, finally, they're proving to be the Christian Democrats. We've been talking about that for so many years. Finally, they're being legitimated in the Western press as a version of Christian Democrats that was in Europe. So that's a good sign. That's going into that direction. And having a debate within Israel. Having a debate within Israel is very difficult without Israel feeling under threat. That's a big, I mean, I don't know how you're going to stare Israeli public. Yeah, I think one Israeli official once said to me something that really shocked me, but was very nice. He said what the Palestinians did with the Nakba movement was amazing, because they took from us the fact that Palestinians from Syria and Lebanon tried to enter the Golan Heights, and they broke through the wall and entered into Israel, although they were shot at. He said they became the Jews. They became the Jews. That they came in with no defenses and accepted to be shot at. That took from Israel an incredible moral power it had, that if it loses it, it links again to the World Zionist Organization there, coming to your question, how it links, it takes away a moral argument that Israel often used. Now, do I address your question? I mean, I think that many people also working now, you need also to work on the legal structure of the state. I think, the more I think about it personally, I realize that will be easier to talk about a binational state than a democratic secular state. because it acknowledges the nationalism of two parties, it acknowledges the institutional structure of the two nations, and also it allows the Palestinians inside Israel they are the best place to play that role. Can they play it? We still do not have the political leadership. Azmi Bishara was considered to be the political leadership, and we saw how badly he was attacked. And actually, if you talk to some Israeli officials, they tell you it was a mistake of him not to go back. He should have come back, be imprisoned, and then it would have become a galvanized political cause. Okay, I'm not going to go into the reason why he did not go back, but it just shows you the problem of a new leadership. So I hope I addressed that. So, for the time being, what's going to happen is a struggle for rights. The more you frame Palestinian struggle as a struggle for equal rights, the more you're walking towards the one-state solution. And that hopefully can allow more internal debate. Now, coming to your question about the Arab Jew. I am totally aware that the Arab Jews vote for Shas, and they're even more anti-Palestinian than the Ashkenazi. But because the struggle is more with the Ashkenazis than it is with the Palestinians. Israel, the Arab Jews are so angry at the Ashkenazi establishment, and there is an attempt to revendicate themselves. But it's true, you're right, they are totally into the Zionist project, and they're totally part of the Zionist project of, we are Israelis, we're under threat, we don't want to live with the Arabs. But I think in the long run, this is an argument, again, if you frame it, if you look at the new generation of Israelis of Arab descent, even of Ashkenazi, the new generation, kids are in their 20s. The fact that kids in Rothschild Street put out a sign, this is our Tahrir Square. For me, this is major. This is major. It's a reflection of a changed generation. A generation that has no problem of Jews, who have no problem to identify with the Arabs, take something from the Arab, and you see the Arab in very positive sign. And Israel now is no longer the only democracy in the Middle East. You took away many things. You're basically talking about a new generation who's not scared of seeing the Arab or seeing the Palestinian. And I think the less suicide bombings you're going to have, the more likelihood that you're going to see more and more Israelis who are below 30 wanting to meet Arabs and wanting to meet Palestinians, and also carry this discourse of rights versus nation. Now, your point about the Jewish diaspora, it's more complicated because, there's AIPAC on the one hand, but you have also the new J Street, which very much challenges the argument. It's still within a two-state formula, I agree. You have your doubts about them. But I agree, the Jews outside Israel are also very diverse group. The relationship to Israel is not all uniform. And you can work a lot with those. You can work with those who are not, those who emphasize that we don't need Israel. Yeah, Israel needs to exist, or, I don't know if Israel needs to exist, but Jewish nationalism needs to be protected, but it doesn't have to be at the expense of the Arabs. You go back to Martin Buber's argument, and Hannah Arendt, whoever. So, I know it's not a very satisfactory answer to you. I don't have the answers, but this also again proves the challenges.
I have a question about timing. First, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I sense a great urgency, and that you mentioned within your time frame, 10, 15 years, we have to figure this out. And I think in 10, 15 years, it's going to be, if things don't, things are changing so fast, but if things were to progress, extrapolate from here, we're talking about everything tied in a neat package. Because there will be almost no Palestinian land. There will be the Indian reservations that so many of them want. The settlement blocks will be around them, the walls will be around them. Every day in Deir Istia, they're stealing more trees and more land. And in Beit Omar, they're stealing more trees and more land. 5 settlements around Beit Omar, stealing children at night to bring them into prison. Around Awalanja, their walls is almost in a circle around them. And Masha, the wall is already all around. They've already lost over 90% of the land. And it seems like a lot of this one-state, two-state conversation is a smoke screen. They'll say whatever they want. Iran, or we're going to attack Iran. So the Palestinians are off the front pages while they every day steal more and more land until it's done.
Yeah.
And then there will be no more Palestinian land except the little Indian reservations, so they have enough people there who can go do the menial labor on the settlements because they don't have any more land. So I have this, I think this is important, but there's part of me that's like screaming, there's something, they're changing the game. Israel's in control. They're changing the game every single day. The package will be done in a year or two, it seems. And I have friends who are losing their land every day, and their children every day. So is there something that we can be doing? And a lot of this conversation about what they do. Are they going to have one state? Are they going to have two states? Are they going to have a federation? But I'm an American, and is there something else that we can talk about so we can stop their control so they don't completely finish their facts on the ground in 2 years, so it doesn't really matter so much.
That's good.
Are the hunger strikers going to have any effect? First there were 2 of them, now there are 1,000 of them. It seems to be having a big effect on Palestinian opinion in the territories. Is that going to lead me?
My question, in a sense, comes to another part of the issue, and that is one way of looking at the history is that for the last 20 years, Israeli society has been moving further to the right, and at many levels. Colleagues have pointed out the change in the young people, the youth in the IDF now, and the makeup of the bodies politic, the various political parties, recognizing that if perhaps some motion on the other side at a very specific kind of level, and that is the level of security, where you get a number of retired generals or intelligence figures pointing to the fact that a failure to find a solution with the Palestinians creates a burden on Israel which they don't want to accept. But this still is a small segment, and as I follow the polling, is not a majority by a long shot. So when one looks at the movement at the political level, at the social level in Israeli society, there seems very little to give me confidence that they would be able to enter the kinds of discussions that are needed if you're to get anything like the movement toward a workable single state, even if it's 10 or 15 years. And I noticed then on the Palestinian side, talking recently with Sari Nusseibeh, reading his interview, there are Palestinians who are essentially saying, we're not going to get a state anytime soon. Let's now look inward to our society, build its institutional norms and the like. And I look at these two movements, and I, in a sense, ask you now to help interpret what this means. At what point does any degree of optimism run out? And in its place, what can be placed? Are there things that I've overlooked in this that would create alternate options in real terms? That is, that can be backed by the societies on both sides to achieve the kind of change which you're talking about.
These are all very good questions indeed, and I'm going to try to link them together. Maybe the hunger strike, I'll start first. I think the hunger strike is another example by which you're trying to frame Palestinian struggle in terms of rights and a non-violent strategy of resistance, which is incredibly powerful. I mean, and it given also today that you can internationalize it, and everybody knows about it so quickly. Palestinian did hunger strike in the 70s and the 80s. It was not as well publicized as it is now. So I think it's in the step of emphasizing that Palestinian rights is a rights for equal rights, for human rights. So I would see it in that angle. Now, concerning the question about the facts on the ground and the urgency, I mean, this is the Zionist project. I mean, this is nothing new about it. And it all falls into the same idea that it is a one state from the sea to the river. Okay? And this has always been the conundrum of the Zionist project in Israel, because Israel's, I would say, since Netanyahu's first government in 96, because it was anti-Rabin. I mean, Rabin, I think, is an Israeli establishment that understood that having a Palestinian state is in Israel's best interest, even if giving up land. And the fact that he was assassinated by a settler by Jewish religious fundamentalists. And the reaction of the Israeli public reveals that the Israeli society is very divided on this issue. I think, it's bad for it in the long run. Because what's saving the Palestinian and the whole Palestinian issue are two things. The Palestinians are going to remain on the land. So, no matter what, it's going to become harder and harder, but look what happened in Gaza and they're still there. You would have thought half of the people would have got out of the tunnel and left it. No, they're still there. I think this continuous resilience of the Palestinians, they're staying, and they're growing demographically. The fact is, Israel reached a stage where demographically it will not change anymore. There's no more, the era of immigration is over for Israel. After 60 years of existence, now the shape of the Israeli society is as is. And there are some serious internal issues that Israel has to face, which bringing in immigrants will not solve it. Okay? Which is basically now, is it going to go along a religious path, or will it go through a democratic path? And this is something which is a big debate for the mainstream Israeli as well as Israeli political figures who are arguing. And there was an article by Avram Burg the other day in Haaretz on Independence Day, basically saying we need a constitution, and we need a constitution that upholds rights, including rights to Palestinians. He's basically saying we're going to a direction of binationalism. So there is some very serious, what is happening on both camps is an internal discussion. Okay? Because we are now, for the next 10 years, in the politics of the wasted time, what a daya. There is no solution in the horizon, and everybody in the meantime are trying just to consolidate their position and figure out what they should do next. The best thing the Palestinians know how to do is steadfastness, even if this time it turned against us. That's the Palestinians are saying, okay, we stay there until we figure out what we do different. And I think in that respect, the debate that Salim Nusayb is talking about is very important. The Palestinians are looking introvert, are saying, look, having a Palestinian state or a PA does not solve our problem. Caring about institutions is very important as much as caring about the outcome. This is a new generation debate. Abu Mazen and all his guys do not think in these terms. But if you look at every Palestinian below the age of 45, at the new Fatah leadership, even the new Hamas leadership, these are kids or people, no longer kids because they're in the 40s, they talk in institutional terms. They know that there are certain things you cannot trespass. And if you trespass, it's called illegal. It's not called that you're a patron or you're being a basha or you're being, So this generational shift about how you do politics is very important. But it is an introvert discussion. That's true. You cannot avoid it and you need to have it. But it is promising because it's no longer an old paradigm. The old paradigm is the only thing we know. And you cannot avoid it, the resistance of, you always like to work through a system you know. The devil you know is always better than the devil you don't know. But people are aware that this cannot be sustainable in the long run. So the internal discussion is good. The internal discussion might not turn as we wish it to turn, like in Israel, as you said. If Israel opts to go through a religious path, religion is more important, this is the land of Israel. The settlers, what they're saying is that Palestinians have rights. Not national rights, but political rights. Now, Israel's project has been, if you look at it, you can give it one reading, has been about emptying the Palestinian struggle of a national dimension, making the Palestinians individual, struggling against the occupation, rather a national movement claiming self-determination. This is why people like Hanan Ashrawi, Kamil Mansour, and Salim Nusayb sometimes are against giving up the Palestinian state project. Because they're saying this is feeding directly into the Zionist project, is emptying the Palestinian of a national dimension. That we are just people, we are just individuals. Now it's true, it is alarming. It represents the defeat of the Palestinian national project. Does it mean the defeat of the Palestinian people? No. Does it mean that the Palestinian people need to redefine the struggle? Yes. It's redefining it like we have. Let's go through a civil rights movement. That's basically what's being asked here. The core issue is how you can go through a civil rights movement as a Palestinian without losing your Palestinianhood. And you can't. Your Palestinianhood has to be redefined as it. But what saves us as Palestinians is that we are part of the Arab world. It is true. We would have become reservations if we were not part of the Arab world. That's the only thing that has saved the Palestinian cause. Because Israel, at the end of the day, is in a sea of Arab countries. And with the Arab Spring, Arab countries are basically sending a message to Israel. You are, from now on, not off the hook. You are not immune anymore. We're not powerful enough to defeat you, But we're powerful enough to say no, to ostracize you. And Israel doesn't like to be ostracized. Because the society imposes on it further internal discussion and introversion. And introversion scares Israel. I mean, one of the reasons, in my view, why Sharon was so violent during the Second Intifada is because it came at the end of 7 years of peace process. And in that peace process, Israelis stopped thinking in a siege mentality. The Israelis were saying, they started thinking about post-Zionism, that you don't need Zionism. We don't need to always be in a war metaphor. That we want to make peace with the Palestinians. That we can find an alternative way of existing. And for Sharon, this is completely against what an Israeli ethos is, because once Israel is no longer in a siege mentality, then it needs to look into itself and say, okay, do I want to be religious? And what does it mean to be religious? Or do I want to maintain some institutions? And how do I maintain democratic institutions if some people want to make the Sabbath, I mean, it has a Sabbath legal already, but want to have some more religious, are we going to be based on a religious law, or are we going to be based on a secular law? And that can bring an Israeli implosion, which can only serve the Palestinian cause. So I think once Israel gets rid of an external threat, it will have to face an internal discussion. And how they're going to do it is for them to resolve it. Now, the core question is how far it can really marginalize the Palestinian question. I mean, for the time being, it tried. But in the long run, I don't think it can do it for very long. The core issue is, as you said, how far the internal discussion is going to bring to the fore new leadership. And this, I don't see it yet. It's true. I'm worried about it because the Arab Spring gave the promise that you can do politics without political parties. I'm too much of a political historian, economist to know that you can't do politics without political parties. But at the same time, I have to admit many Palestinians and Israelis do not want to get dirty with party politics. So we come into an American solution then, right? How do you do politics through political parties? Or how you can avoid the power of political parties? Institutions, go back. So frame it in a state for all its rights. I'm hoping that the new generation, something is going to come up. Nobody predicted the first Intifada, and it happened. So nobody predicted the Arab Spring, and it happened. When will it happen that something is going to shake over there? But I am like you. I do tend to think, though, that it's through the settlers that you can do much more than actually through the left. I genuinely believe that, paradoxically, because the settlers see you day to day, and the settlers are aware that you have some rights. And the first discussion is let's talk about the right, and then you can move forward. Acknowledging the other is the first step towards moving forward. If you don't want to be an oppressor. Yes. Please.
Yeah. First, this was a very, very thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion. I think the best I've heard.
Thank you. Thank you.
Solution.
Coming from you, it means a lot. Thank you very much.
Going back to the 1940s, when I was part of the Magnus Gruber camp.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, I want to introduce a little wrinkle here. I'm sorry Yoram Meital is not here. When I spoke to him after his talk, I tried to understand what the one state is that some of the Israeli rights haven't done. And he pointed out something very important, not in his talk, but later, and that is that they do not have in mind including Gaza.
Yes.
So if you want to take that as the beginning of the one state, I think that, if you want to take sort of the Israeli view of one state as a starting point, you have a real problem because it excludes Gaza for the obvious reason. Because by excluding Gaza, it excludes 1.5 million Palestinians.
Right.
So I think that's a kind of a challenge here to your analysis.
Yes, of course.
And also to start to say those.
Yeah. A very good point. Yeah. Joe,
Also, I think based on that point and then linking to another, I've worked with Rob Froman, who knows Peacenik of the settlers, including the fact that the settlers is a misnomer. There's so many different settlers within that movement. The fact that the religious Zionist left came from Gush Etzion is a fascinating concept. And I want to say that, but I don't think it will. I guarantee the one state of the settlers will never give you a right return. That's what
of course.
I think that's a challenge, but I wish I could share your optimism about the Israeli next generation. The Israeli next generation is the most depressed generation of any of them, and the major reason being...
Depressed?
And I'll tell you why they're depressed. I don't play games, but the fact is the Palestinian trauma didn't stop after the second Intifada like the Israelis did. But the second intifada, the Israelis deal with terrorism by just pretending everything is normal. But it left psychological scars. And the kids were 5 and 7 between the second intifada. And I was there during then, when it was all going on for 2 sustained years. You've had workshops in America about 9/11, about 7/7 in the UK. The workshops the Israelis haven't got to base there. Alongside the war, these kids do not want to see the other.
Yeah.
And the latest polling that came out is that 54% of them worried or they want every day that has been hurt. That's the stat, and that's the reality. And so one of the challenges is that I wish I could buy into the optimism that they're calling it the square, that they're all going to be great and they want to fit in. But my real challenge, and this is why I go back to one of the most things that I was really happy to talk about, was about anti-normalization, and something that I went for one voice, and the challenge of the one voice internationally as well as in the region-based. And I think that one of the challenges to go back to the Palestinian camp is one of anti-normalization, because the Israelis aren't going to go and want to see Palestinians. And if the Palestinians is the weaker party and want to try and convince people of the one state, they need to break this intellectual barrier. And I understand that how could you do that when it's an occupation of the mind, but ultimately the kids aren't going to come to you, you've got to go to the kids.
Well, that's the message from South Africa. You need to, in any attempt to create a one-state solution, whether you like it or not, you need to address the fear of your oppressor. And the one who are best placed to do that are the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Then we go back to them again. You're totally right. That's something that needs to be addressed. The question, who's going to address it? And I believe the best who can address it are the Palestinian citizens inside Israel, because they're the best placed. They are there, they're in contact with them, they can work on that. But, of course you're traumatized by these things, but, and the politics of fear is a very essential element of any state and all that. I don't want to paint a rosy picture. When I go to the West Bank, and every time I cross, I'm telling you, I just crossed the borders into Israel, and I had one of the worst treatment I had. At the end of it, I did not want to see anybody on the other side myself, and it is nothing what I have compared to what others go through. But I know, hope and optimism can change a lot. It depends on the context, if you see, but the whole debate is that you need to come forward with a program which is inclusive. And I agree with you, the ball is in the Palestinian camps. If you want to promote the one-state idea, it can only come from the Palestinians in the inclusive sense that we talk about. And it needs to address the fears of the Israelis. As I said to you, it also needs to address the Jewish question, all these things. Okay? The question, who's going to do it, when you're going to do it, how you're going to change. Because the debate of the one state is still not in a power. It is involved in seeking to change the power balance by embarking on a non-violent strategy through the BDS and through information and through advertising. So that's where it goes. But they are also very well aware it's not this that's going to break Israel tomorrow. It's a long-term strategy, which we have to wait and see where it's going to go. But here I come back. I want to link these two questions. The Gaza element. The one status within Israel, they're basically talking about Israel exists, we have this demographic reality, we need to deal with it, we want to remain Jewish and democratic, the only way to do it is to give them individual rights. We solve the problem. Okay, this is maintaining the reality, an improved reality, but this is maintaining the reality. But in important concessions, because you're giving them rights. Okay. Does this eliminate the right of return? Of course, Israelis are not for the right of return. But there is a very interesting Israeli Arab origin author who who said the only way how you can move forward is that we have to accept the settlement and the right of return together. Which I agree. The settlements now, especially after 45 years of existence, the settlers who have born in the settlement today are as attached to Palestine as I am, emotionally or whatever, practically. Coming and saying you're going to dismantle and you're going to go on the other side, it's not going to happen. This is not the solution. The question is how are you going to convince them that just as they have a right over there, those who have been expelled have a right to it. And here comes Gaza. Because, Gaza is part of the geography of, we know practically Israel wanted to get rid of Gaza because Gaza is a hassle. And practically we know that Israel is envisioning a solution to the conflict whereby Gaza's future is to be resolved with Egypt, and slowly the West Bank's future is going to be solved with Jordan. That's the Israeli plan. Halas. We built the wall, we unilaterally declared our borders, you don't like it, tough luck, your future is with Amman or with Egypt. The real question is, will the Palestinians accept it? Because the only power the Palestinians have is to sign the document or not to sign it. And so far they have not signed it. And if you look at the history of Israel, if you look a little bit of its history, it realizes that what it did with the Palestinians inside Israel, despite all what it did with them, despite being under military rule for 18 years, 19 years, despite giving them full citizenship rights, okay? They are not becoming fully Israelis. You have a vivid example of these people who are not giving up something called their Palestinian nationalism. Is that going to finish? Is Israel counting that in 20, 30 years' time, all the refugees would have died, the descendants of the refugees don't know nothing about Palestine, it's going to be over, we're going to forget it? I don't think so, because they remain part of the Arab world, which it still needs to address, that Israel needs to address its relationship to the Arab world. So I see, I'm not very optimistic about the settlers' version of the state, but I do see it that we are in a colonial reality, and we finally can frame it like that we are in a colonial reality. And the question Israel is being faced with, does it want to persevere in this colonial reality or not? The Oslo process allowed us to suspend this discussion. No, it's not colonial. We're two states, two equal national groups. We're going to solve it like that. This discussion is over. And to everybody's eyes, including Israel, is aware that what it has on the ground is a colonial reality. And it doesn't like to consider itself colonial Israel. It's a fact. It's not colonial. It's Western. It's modern. It's democratic. How can it be colonial? But yes, it is colonial, and they're facing it that they are colonial. And any colonial reality does not persevere. It can live long, but it is not eternal. Does this mean it's going to be resolved tomorrow? No, but I think we have ingredients, at the discourse level and at the activism level that gives us promises that we might be going in the right direction, but the train has left the station, but it's going very slowly. If you want to give this metaphor, yeah? And there are big challenges, I don't deny you, but I think it's the only game in town, I suppose. Yeah.
I can go back full circle to something that you said, which is now, of course, because my memory is like a sieve. I can't remember the name of a very important blogger, Israeli blogger, who mentioned recently something that you mentioned. He said, people say it's untenable to keep the situation. Actually, what is most cost-effective for Israel is to keep things as they are.
Exactly.
And he actually did it very beautifully.
Yeah.
And I'm like, really? I was very upset. I was convinced.
Yeah.
Right?
True. Yeah.
So why should there be a resolution? Why?
Yeah, exactly.
Because the demographics are
Why?
Yeah, exactly.
There's no need.
Well, that's Israel's argument. Exactly. That's Israel's argument.
So
But
what are we talking about?
it's because for those in Gaza and those also in the West Bank and those who, it is tenable now, but it's not going to be tenable for 10 years. 10 years down the road, it will not be tenable. There will be kids who grown up who never saw Israel and want to see Israel, and there are kids who want to be able. When you talk to Palestinians today, they don't talk to you. If you go and talk in the streets of Ramallah, Nablus, even Jerusalem, the Jerusalemites now are going seeking Israeli passports. For 45 years, they fought against voting in Israeli election, against acquiring Israeli passports. Now they're going to say, we want Israeli passport. Imagine, if all Palestinians go to the wall, you have a march of 5,000 people saying, we want Israeli ID. Israel will be petrified. Just imagine people go, but for this to happen, the president have to have the internal discussion. This discussion is happening. How sustainable it's going to be. Just duration is not eternal. And people are very fed up with the PA. They're keeping it because they benefit from it. And this is why it goes back to the status quo. But as you know, as a historian, status quo is never permanent. But the question is how are you in a position that you're going to mobilize, be able to capitalize on a good opportunity or not? That's the core question, because I think for the one state to succeed or not, there needs lots of homework to be done on the Palestinian side, more than the Israelis, in order when the moment is right to capture it. Otherwise, you're going to go again for another 10 years. But again, I say what saves the Palestinian is that we're part of the Arab world. And the Arab world is changing, for the good or for the bad, even if we're going to have a counter-revolution. We're having counter-revolution.
Thank you, Leila. This was a very